Well, I had a suggestion, Sharon. You tell me if it's right.
Well, bring your microphone to your mouth.
Yep. I just had a quick suggestion. Professor Mazar really never got a chance to summarize his view on the origins. He got to that point, and he only had like 2 paragraphs left. I wonder, for purposes of contrast and comparison, we might get very briefly his summary of the Canaanite or the origins of Israel, please.
Just briefly.
Oh, this one. I was more than happy not to say it because I don't have a good solution. But
that's a good solution.
Yeah, but if you wish,
please. Oh, just your
with
summary.
all modesty, but perhaps we should say.
Can you summarize without reading just the?
Yeah. Well, I'm not so convinced. I mean, Israel Finkelstein suggested this in 1986 or what? 86 was your Hebrew book. So it was a good suggestion. I mean, to see all this as a local process, yeah, as you call it, a cyclic process. But there are some problems here. For example, when you say the collapse of the Canaanite culture, no grain, so the semi-nomadic people have to settle. But when we look on the map, you don't see the map here, the hill country is in the center, surrounded by valleys. When we dig those valleys, both of us, Bet She'an, Tel Rehov, Megiddo, all this valley of Jezreel, the silo, the grain basket of Palestine, of the land of Israel, we can see that all these cities continue to exist. There was no collapse. That means there was plenty of grain. That means all the basic theory here, the collapse of Canaan, the collapse of the grain-producing lowland, didn't occur. It occurred in the north, Chatzor. It occurred in the south, at Lachish. But most of the cities around the hill country continue to survive. So the theory is a little bit problematic in my view. I think that we don't have a very excellent solution to this problem, and I think that maybe the solution is more complex. That we have here all kinds of groups, reflected maybe in the biblical concept of 12 tribes, 2 mothers and 2 concubines. This idea of the genealogy of Israel perhaps reflects some real historical process, that various groups of people combined together. One of them, many scholars suggested, Frank Cross from Harvard and others, that one of them could be the Moses group, that really passed through the experience of the Exodus. Maybe it was a small group. You asked about Moses. So I showed you the existence of Midianites. All this relationship between Midianites and West Semitic Hebrews, let's call them in this name, who lived in Egypt and were perhaps inspired from ideas in Egypt, may give us some real background for the Moses group that indeed passed through Transjordan and enter the land of Israel. This could be a small group. And other groups joined, local nomadic people. Perhaps some groups that came from Syria. We have the collapse of the Hittite Empire around 1200 BC. Movement of people, groups of people came down to the lowland. And maybe that some of these groups, and for me, when I dig Tel Rehov, I'll show you later today, we have some objects which relate to the late Bronze Age, the 13th century in northern Syria, in the region of Haran, in the region of the Upper Euphrates. And maybe some families arrived from there, and this may explain us all these stories about Jacob and northern Syria and Haran. I don't believe in this 7th century relationship of Jacob to the north. I think that this reflects second millennium ideas. I tend to believe more in larger scale processes in the end of the second millennium BC, which caused all groups of people to a new mode of life, and perhaps one of them, a charismatic leader or a man like Moses or whoever, brought this new belief that caused to this amalgamation of this new group, the Israelite covenant. But when exactly it happened, and how it happened and what are the details of this, we don't know. I think we shall never know. Israel Finkelstein's suggestion is very important. I don't cancel it. I think it's very important. It is one of 3 or 4 theories which exist today relating to the origins of Israel. But it's just one. And for example, Diver will continue to maintain that they came from the lowland. I don't believe that this can be one solution, that they came, all of them, from the lowland. I don't believe in this. I think that the complex was more complicated, and we have here several groups. For example, if we look on the archaeology of Galilee, we shall see their connections and relations to the cities of the coast, Tyre, Sidon, even Cyprus. And perhaps these people were related to dislocated Canaanites of the north. So I think the picture is much more complex.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor.
Now, Brian, if you want to...
Well, my second suggestion was to let Professor McNutt respond first, since we didn't give her much of a chance. Yeah. Please.
I'd be happy to, actually. Just actually going from what Amihai was saying, I'm sorry, I tend to use first names more easily than professor. So just going from what Amihai was just saying, I think is an interesting jumping off point for me. One of the things that I'm particularly interested in is the interpretive process. And I think that one of the really exciting things that's going on, particularly in relation to the way in which we talk about this period, is that there's been a very big shift in how we understand the interpretive process, and so that we have 3 or 4 hypotheses bouncing around. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and then I'd also like to talk a bit about how important this particular period is in, I think, the direction that biblical archaeology has taken and is taking in the future. So give me a nudge if I go on too long. Okay. So I want to, just so going back to Albright, that in Albright's time, what he thought he was doing was constructing a definitive history of Israel, and that it's possible to do that, and then you can kind of use archaeology to kind of plug in the gaps. So, and we no longer believe that we can construct a definitive history. We acknowledge that constructing history is very complex, and we acknowledge that we're constructing it, I think, which is really something that's important to understand. And partly the fact that archaeology, I think, has been very important in sort of expanding the kinds of questions that it's possible for us to ask about history. So in large part, I think that has to do with archaeology, but it also has to do with, I think, a shift in the way that historians and scholars understand their relationship to the past. So I want to say a couple of things about that. One of the things I think you can see here very clearly in the lectures that are being given is that we think of history now more as kind of an ongoing conversation between the past and the present. And so it's more than what we think we know or about the past. It's really kind of a conversation, and as more archaeological materials come to light, we have to sort of shift our understanding and so forth. We also, in contrast to, say, historians, again, of Albright's day, everybody pretty much acknowledges now that complete objectivity is a goal that it's just not something that we can ever reach as historians. The kinds of questions we bring to our investigations, as well as our own biases and presuppositions and so forth, most historians now will acknowledge that that has something to do with the end point of their interpretations. And even something like, whether, okay, if you're trying to interpret, say, this period, do you start with the biblical text, do you start with the archaeology? Even, your starting point will affect really in some way the way in which you interpret something. So scholars are very, I think, typically today very conscious of their own biases and their own cultural and historical backgrounds and so on and so forth. So this allows for obviously a wide variety of constructions, some things that are radically different, but I think that it makes the conversation much more interesting.
What is your
what is my opinion about what happened? I probably agree more with him.
So you're in agreement with that. Okay, good.
Well, now let me, may I inject quickly? What you want to pick up from this, the whole discussion, is what was the character, the makeup of this community we would call Proto-Israel or earliest Israel, okay? And I think if I reflect your two models accurately, Professor Mazar would see quite a diverse mix of peoples from even far afield, long immigration processes in some cases, perhaps local northeasterners like Arameans or from Syria, and a variety mix of people, including Canaanites, I would imagine, yes? And as I understand Professor Finkelstein's model, in this enclosed nomadic model, you would see something perhaps much more localized, primarily Canaanite.
In the Central Hill Country.
Yes, from the Central Hill Country. So there are those implications for understanding the makeup of this group at its very beginning, 1200 BCE, okay? And the other models that Professor Mazar alluded to even throw more into the mix in terms of the complication or the complex nature of this community, okay? But one thing we all would share, I think, generally, is that the older models of a military conquest and even a peaceful infiltration from a predominantly outside or foreign group don't seem to hold up under the scrutiny of the archaeological data. That we have something that has a far more significant indigenous element to it, what we call Canaanite, okay? And different shades of that. And that's a huge shift from the early part of the 20th century.
That, right. Because one of the things that we grow up with,
Yeah.
we bring the audience, we the audience bring this. Sure. One of the things we grow up with is a group of people called the Hebrews, right? Who invade. So it isn't a great military conquest. Maybe it's an infiltration. How do the Hebrews, these people, we have a language we call Ibrit, or the Hebrew, how do these Hebrews impinge on the story that you're talking about? That is, we grow up with it.
Yeah.
And now, do we discard it? Do we drop it? Does it fit into the story in any way?
I'm sorry, before we go on to that, I really think it's important to say just a few words about how important this work is, if I might, because that was the other thing that I wanted to talk about. And just jumping off from the other models, the earlier models, you know, this is really, the study of this particular period, I think, has really been a revolution in biblical archaeology. It's sort of a major shift, in part, I think, in part because I think of Gottwald's mass. I don't know if you know, Norman Gottwald has this massive tome called The Tribes of Yahweh, in which he argues that the destruction layers from this time period are the result of a peasant revolt. But it's a very sort of ideological examination of the history of ancient Israel. Gottwald himself was a very Marxist person, and I mean, actually, in terms of my own bias, one of the reasons that I tend to agree somewhat more with Israel's work is that I'm an anthropologist, and he has made use of anthropological models, so I find that convincing. In any case, it's just that in a way, I think there's been a reaction to Gottwald, you know, so it's like, well, that's crazy, you know, but it made people, I think, start thinking, you know, okay, if you know, these other earlier models, if Albright's model of total conquest is not correct, what else can we say? And also, just very quickly, things like the fact that these surveys started in the 1980s, that there was a kind of a shift in focus to looking at smaller sites rather than large sites with monumental architecture, which had previously been the focus. A turn to considering things like subsistence and economy, which really wasn't done very much in the past. Looking at consideration of a wider geographical context. These kinds of things have really contributed, and anthropological models, I think the use of anthropological models. So this has been a really, really important period, I think, in terms of the way in which archaeologists are going now. So that's it.
Well,
Back to the question of the Hebrews.
Answer to the question.
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
About Hebrews, yes.
Um,
It's, I think for people who grow up with these stories, we've got to deal with that, yes.
Well,
Either Amichai or Israel.
When I was a student in the Hebrew University in
Yes.
I will not tell you when, my Professor Malamat, he gave us an exercise. I'm sorry. I said that my Professor Malamat, Professor of Israelite history or biblical history in the Hebrew University, when I was a student back in the 60s, he gave us an exercise to find all the places in the Bible where the title Hebrew is mentioned, and to examine this title, and to see what is the meaning of this title. And it's interesting to see that in most cases, the Hebrews is the title used by non-Israelites when they describe the Israelites. It's not the title that is used by the Israelites to describe themselves in the biblical text. That's number one. Number two, in many cases, Hebrews are related to some kind of social status. And you know that in the past, they used to relate Hebrew to the term Habiru that was mentioned here several times, which is known from the entire ancient Near East in the second millennium, from many documents. And it's always a social status, a group of people who are not the regular citizens of the cities. They appear as mercenaries or as robbers or as unsettled people. You know, we have in the Elamarna period in the 14th century, Habiru in the Shechem area, exactly in the heartland of the land of Israel. And there were scholars who suggested that the Hebrew, the Bible, the term Hebrews in the Bible is related to the Habiru or Apiru, as we used to call it now, of the 14th, 13th centuries BC. I understand that now, based on philological reasons, which I'm not an expert on this correlation is unacceptable or is not accepted in most circles. But still, we have to think on this term, Hebrew, as a very specific term in the Bible. And I don't know if it's a good term to define the early Israelites of the Hill Country. Maybe yes, I don't know. What do you think, Israel?
Why would they choose the name?
Isn't it also a term, I'm sorry, that is consistently used by outsiders to refer to? Oh, did you say? Okay, I missed that. I missed that part.
That's also the case in the
But if it's a negative term used by outsiders,
It's not negative.
why
It's not
why
negative.
Why would they take it?
Habiru is negative, but
It's not negative. It's not in particular terms.
So Ivri may have another. Israel, do you have a response to that?
Well, I think that, first of all, we can discard the idea that the Israelites came from outside. This is unacceptable. I don't think that we have any proof for that. If you look at the evidence, the archaeological evidence, we are speaking about a process within the Canaanite society of the second millennium BC. But I don't see groups of people coming from Egypt or from Anatolia. Regarding the word, the title Hebrew, well, I would agree with the first part of Amichai's presentation now, talk, that I think Ivri, I still see a connection, I'm sorry, between Ivri and Apiru on the social level, not on the ethnic level. And the description of the early of the Israelites, by the way, you don't find Ivrim so much in Kings, for instance. You find it a lot in Samuel. In Samuel, the compilation there, I'll speak about it later, of the early days of David, the succession to the throne of Solomon. All this material is, in my opinion, the earliest written material in the Hebrew Bible, in the Hebrew text. And therefore, when the term Hebrew appears over there, it is even more significant because it relates, I think, to the social status of those people, the way they were viewed from the outside. Also Apiru, when you look at the Amarna letters, for instance, how they refer to the Apirus. The name is a kind of a negative name that comes from outside.
So now my question to you is, if you say there's a connection between the Apiru and in Hebrew, is that right? In Hebrew?
Yeah,
All right.
a social
That is-
connection.
and if that is the case, and the Apiru are outsiders coming within, then isn't it possible that they're infiltrators? And you said that
No, the Apiru were a social class within the population of Canaan of the second millennium. They were not from outside. They were the troublesome, uprooted groups of the marginal of the late Bronze Age.
My question is, why did, in the final texts, why did we choose, or our leaders, or our writers choose that name to describe us, if it had such negative overtones? You know, it basically it's a pejorative word. Why did we end up with it?
I don't think it was a negative word anymore in the late 8th century. It was negative in the period of Egyptian domination in Canaan until the 12th century. Until the 12th century, 14 and until the 12th century BC. Then it changed. I don't think it was conceived anymore as negative in the late 8th century.
But I have another question to you. If all these texts were written in the 7th century, like the Exodus and so on, where the term Hebrew was taken from in the 7th century? It's a second millennium term.
Well, exactly. That is an indicator, I think, for the fact that the material where you have quite a lot of references to the Hebrews is a bit earlier, especially the material that we have in the book of Samuel.
No, but
it
appears in Exodus.
It's not only one more sentence, you know. I'll speak about it later also, I think. But it's not only the definition as Hebrew equals Apiru and so on. It's not only the word, it's also the similarity in the way of behavior. They describe David indeed as an Apiru. David is an Apiru in Samuel. It's not only that they call him Hebrew. He is an Apiru. He is a leader of a gang on the margin of society, troublemakers, very difficult to control, running away from authority, and so on.
Which fits a second millennium idea of the Hapiru, not 7th century. So this is something to take care of.
By the way, it's now a quarter to Yaakov, just very briefly.
Okay. I wanted to quote Amichai. I wanted to quote Amichai in his book, in the book that he edited about the controversy that we are discussing here, where he says that he proposes an intellectual exercise to think about the history, to try to reconstruct the history of the Jewish people without the Bible. Because after all, the Bible is one of the biggest and most important archaeological finds in the world. Just imagine what would have happened if we found today a manuscript of a few 100,000 words in Hebrew from 2,500 years ago to 2,800 years ago. This would be a terrific sensation. If we didn't have it, he says, what kind of history can we reconstruct only from archaeological terms? And he says, in page 103 of this book, he says, I cannot agree with the proposal that you can write history on the basis of archaeological finds only. And I believe that, he says in another place in the same article, same chapter, I believe that we can interpret archaeological findings in various ways, and from all points of view, from their date and from their significance as far as the nation is concerned. My feeling is that we can deal with this problem of origin of nations not only in comparison with ancient history, but in comparison with modern history. How did nations start? And the word Ivri, is a language. It became a language. Language is one of the most important